I think that there needs to be greater capacity within the art sector for research to action. And when I say that, I mean the art sector itself needs to be driving policy. We need to have the tools, the understanding, the training, the connections to truly impact policy. And one thing that mass culture is really focused on at the moment is how do we first engage the sector in what are the research priorities and what needs to be investigated together and what that process looks like. But then how do you then take that research and create it so that it drives change?
Another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm with Robin Sokoloski, who I believe is in Toronto. Welcome, Robin.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, it's fun. We talk on another project quite regularly, but I'm really happy to have you on the show. It so happens that it's the last show. I've just decided it's the last show of last episode of this season, the 41st conversation that I've had. So let's start the way we've started with the other episodes, to have you introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your background, what you do, and then we'll jump into the issue of reality. So, Robin.
Thank you, Claude. My name is Robin Sokoloski. I, for as long as I can remember, have been involved in the arts community. I had a very fortunate upbringing where I realized very early on what my calling was in life, which was to work for and with artists and to do whatever I can to bring their ideas into fruition. So I am an arts manager by nature. I first started way back in Ottawa when I was attending Carleton, and knowing I wanted to work in the arts felt like I needed to be in an institution, but then my whole world was opened up when I was introduced to a group of graffiti artists there in Ottawa and started working with them, and just recognized the importance of community engaged arts, youth arts, and arts in public space, and what a difference and transformation that can make. So my life has always been guided by those particular aspects within the arts field, but then also doing what I can to work with and for artists. I worked for 10 plus years at the Playwrights Guild of Canada, serving their needs and promoting and protecting their work. And now I'm the Director of Organizational Development at Mass Culture, again, providing service to the arts community by bringing us together through our commonality, which is knowledge, and doing whatever I can to create greater capacity for arts and culture research in the sector.
Right on. Well, that's important work, and I appreciate what you do and the fact that mass culture exists and is doing vital work in Canada and with international partners. So let's talk about the reality episode, which I think you're familiar with, and the idea of reality. What are your thoughts on the idea of accepting reality and reality in relation to, say, denial?
Reality. So I guess I come at this from a very creative perspective in terms of thinking, how can we add more dynamism into our world and think about ideas as a group of people coming together to bring those ideas to life. And so I approach everything I do in bringing those ideas into fruition, which to me is then reality. So I think the more creative and the more you can rally people who are creative together to come up with and devise very interesting ways, new approaches of tackling current real life situations, such as our current traditional structures, not tearing them down, but how can we then think about doing those things differently? there's just so many endless potential options. And I feel that we often limit ourselves because we give in to traditional models, or because there are certain structures in place that we have to abide by and feel as though we need to live by. But that isn't necessarily true. That's where I feel reality is blurred. We do have the power as human beings to change human systems. And so I think I'm very curious of working with people who are like-minded, who want to operate differently. I often use the organizational structure as an example of that, because it is, as we all know, not a perfect model. We complain about it often, and yet we always default to it. So how can we come together, organize, and bring ideas to life in different ways by changing that current system, make it more equitable, make it more inclusive, find ways of bringing people in and not necessarily having them commit, but have them come touch and go when they need to. And I feel as though there'll be a more range of ideas brought to the table, and just a more enriching experience, and being able to bring solutions into reality by thinking of how our structures are set up and how we could do those things differently.
Cultural theorist Thomas Berry. Our challenge is to create a new language, even a new sense of what it is to be human. It is to transcend not only national limitations, but even our species' isolation, to enter into the larger community of living species. This brings about a completely new sense of reality and value. Historian Paul Krupp. We've experienced that. Some things seem impossible at first, and then a group of people get together and say, well, it could work this way, why not? And then almost by thinking it becomes possible in our minds, and then we go about do it, and we see that things can change. So I understand that. And the other topic is equally difficult is ecological grief in the sense that I've experienced it myself. I literally felt in my body that the environment around me is changing. And so what are your thoughts on ecological grief?
Well, I grew up in Brantford, Ontario, right along the Grand River, which borders the Six Nations Reserve. I've always been very tied to that particular body of water. And I feel as though every time I go back, I'm very lucky, and my parents still live in the house I grew up in. So every time I go back there, through the different chapters of my life, I've seen it grow and change, and it has a huge effect on me. It's also my very favorite place in the whole entire world, and has created so many memories for me personally. But I completely also at the same time recognize every time I step foot on that land along the water, it's impacting it as well. So I've always had that connection to it. I actually know someone who lost their life because of that river. So it's something that has always reminded me that nature is untamed. We can't control it, but we are certainly impacting it. And so that has always acted as a symbol in my life, as something that's as almost like a yardstick, an ever-changing image in my mind, in my life, that I have constantly gone back to and witnessed all the things that have happened by reflecting on that particular environment. So I think that is probably it's a reminder to me of all the things that are going on in the world. My sister has two small children that I'm extremely close with, and they're very their understanding and knowledge of what's currently the climate crisis is takes up more of their mind than it ever did mine at their age. So that's also a stark reminder. And so when I walk along that trail along the Grand River with them, I can't help but feel a bit of heartache because of all of the things that have that we've done as human beings, myself, and not being conscious enough of the world around me and how I could have had a greater impact at a much earlier stage in my life. So that certainly that looms over me, and all I can do now is start from today and do what I can with the strengths that I have accumulated through my experiences with the art sector to try and do better.
We are working on a project, you and I and others, that's been announced called SCALE, the Sectoral Climate Arts Leadership for the Emergency. That's an example of your commitment to art and environment projects. But what are your thoughts on, or where you just talked about your roots and your connection to land? Why did you get involved, say, with SCALE or with art and environment projects?
Well, I've always come at it from a perspective of the arts, and feel the arts can do so many meaningful things in the world. One very important one being that of the environment. Senator Patricia Bovey has an octopus image, a metaphor that she uses of all the different ways, the tentacles that arts can impact positive change in society. Climate and sustainability certainly being one of those tentacles. I decided to become a part of SCALE because where my strengths lie are in coordinating and bringing the arts community together, a very fragmented sector at times, to come around a common goal and make people feel as though, insert a sense of ownership within people to have the freedom, the power, and feel as though they can take part in a real meaningful way in the work that's being done. And I feel that the way that SCALE has come about by a group of people, because something always has to start from somewhere, but with the understanding that this can belong to everybody and should, and recognizes that there are many things going on within the arts sector and beyond that are working towards the same common goal of creating a better world for future generations in terms of the environment, is, I think, a really good starting place to go from. Mass Culture is currently involved in a project with 5 different academic institutions, one of them being with Dalhousie. We're working with Dr. Tara Wright and a research intern. Her name's Emma Bug. She will be a research in residence come this fall, working with an arts organization to develop a qualitative impact framework on how that particular organization measures itself in terms of climate and sustainability. And when I say that, it's not necessarily whether that particular organization is greening itself, but how it's changing mindsets. And how, if it is doing that, can we understand that better so that we can create some type of tool so that we can share that with other arts organizations to understand better whether or not they're also affecting that same change. So that'll take place over a year, and we hope to present that next spring. And hopefully we come up with a very valuable tool that can be utilized by other arts organizations to determine whether or not they're doing the work to change the minds of society when it comes to art, when it comes to climate.
Well, there's in parallel to that, Ian Garrett and Devin Hardy are working on the Creative Green Tools, which is more about operations. So one does have to. We were chatting earlier about the notion of measurement, and it sounds a little daunting and dry, but in fact, it's really exciting to be able to know where you're at, and what are some of the challenges. And so if you actually do surveys and analytical work, it really helps map out where we are and where we need to go. So I get that. And in mass culture, it's an interesting mandate because it's basically used, as you say, knowledge, but we live in a digital world. So it's very much around those digital tools that we need to do. Where do you see some of the gaps? I know you're working on one of the work groups at Scale, looking at knowledge and information and those kinds of things, research. Where do you think some of the gaps are? I mean, you've just identified one in the sense that you're partnering with researchers, but what are some of the other gaps that you think are important for the arts sector to not only be aware of, but to become involved in and to including the funders, right? The whole community needs to kind of wrap their head around the fact that we're in a climate emergency. This is not business as usual. It is COVID recovery, but in fact, that's an opportunity to do things differently. So what are your thoughts on that, Robin?
I think that there needs to be greater capacity within the arts sector for research to action. And when I say that, I mean the art sector itself needs to be driving policy. We need to have the tools, the understanding, the training, the connections to truly impact policy. And one thing that mass culture is really focused on at the moment is how do we first engage the sector in what are the research priorities and what needs to be investigated together and what that process looks like. But then how do you then take that research and create it so that it drives change? So those are the things that I'm very curious about at the moment, and finding connections, partnerships, collaborations to work with others to better understand what that process looks like. And I think that does require relationships, strong relationships with funders, with government, with academia. And I really think that mass culture can play a role in brokering those connections and also ensuring that those who don't normally have a seat at the table, those unlikely, unusual suspects who don't even understand that they actually are policymakers by just doing the art that they're doing, need to be a part of those conversations. So what we're trying to do, what's really important to me, is to manage to keep that little crack in the door open that I think that Arts Day on the Hill or connections we have with certain MPs or MPPs or councillors is totally busted open, so that we have a full flow through of conversations, dialogues to really work on how to solve problems and how the arts sector can help with that problem solving process. I think oftentimes we're viewed as to raise awareness or to potentially just provide entertainment or aestheticize something. But I do think that we have these transferable skills within the sector to be able to be a huge player, have a seat at the table to help solve problems, real complex problems.
Well, David Maggs's piece, Art in the World After This, he was one of my, yeah, it's actually my first interview back on March 25th in Vancouver when I was there, and he and others have made some pretty strong proposals and challenges in a way to the sector that we can do a lot more, and it can be fun, in the sense that the work is going to be even more relevant, even more impactful. Yes, it will require more resources, but it's also a question of reallocating some of those resources and rethinking how we function, because with the change, the inclusion, the focus on reconciliation, the different world we live in now that we're much more aware of the Canada as it really is, for better or for worse, we really need to grapple with that and work together and develop the tools and work from the ground up, right? Because so I worked in government for 20 years. A lot of it comes from the top down. This is what the government thinks you should do. Well, the community has to respond, and say, yes, on this, maybe not there, because we have organized ourselves and we have a voice and a sense of where we want to go. And the word policy is not just words on a paper, like you say. It's the work. It's practice. It's all the culture that comes through our artistic activities. So I don't need to convince you of that, but it's certainly exciting to know that you're there thinking that way and working in partnership with different groups, and that the environmental issue is not a side issue. It's not the only issue. It's one of the many interconnected issues that have to be kind of woven together for things to make sense going forward.
Journalist Julia Rosen. Society tends to see climate change as a scientific issue rather than a cultural and political challenge that demands our full humanity, the kind more often explored and addressed through art.
Yeah, it's very true. And I think that one thing that we also need to get better at as a sector is intersectionality with those other social domains. We certainly take up the mantle when we come to think about certain issues that are going on within society, but we don't necessarily ingrain ourselves as much as we should. And that requires looking outside of our sector and developing relationships and partnerships with others. And of course, that takes a lot of time. All of this work, it doesn't happen overnight. So we need to find ways of bringing people together. And I think mass culture as an intermediary that can bring those different groups together cross-sectorally to have conversations about what we can all equitably provide towards something needs to happen more often. And I'm really hopeful seeing the new commitments provided by the Canadian government and the specifics that were provided yesterday of where the funding is going to be allocated, that there is a real appetite and interest for social innovation. So I do hope, my hope is that the arts community is given opportunities to really think through and consider what that means to us.
Yeah, and I, in my very humble way, am trying to prepare the way for some of that by sharing knowledge, by talking to people that I think they should hear about. This last week, I was talking to Daniel Boutet, who is a philosopher and educator in Quebec, and people don't necessarily know each other across the linguistic divide, but also regionally, and so that there's a lot of learning to be done, but it doesn't necessarily have to be heavy lifting. It can just be knowing that somebody has the same idea as you, and they've developed a tool or a way of doing it that you could, refer to. And I think a lot of it is connecting the dots, and there's some building to be done, but there's also a lot of connecting the dots in various ways and making sure that those dots have all of the voices connected, as opposed to the same old voices that are problematic because they're not sufficiently diverse.
The conversation doesn't change if you always involve the same people in it. So that's why we definitely need to put efforts into involving different voices, those who haven't been a part of the conversation before, certainly.
So, Robin Sokoloski, we're going to talk about art now. We already have, because you've brought it into the conversation naturally. But just more broadly, what do you see that we talk about the unique value proposition of the arts, right? And that's kind of laden. What does that mean? What do the arts do that nothing else can do? And in particular, on an issue as complex as the climate emergency.
When I was reading David Megg's report for the first time, and he went over the three different modes of what arts can do for climate, greening the sector, raising the profile, and then reauthoring, that third one is so challenging to articulate. However, it has been I realized after reading that something that I have felt mission driven since a very young age, to find ways of making other people, specifically outside of the arts, to understand what the arts can do for society in that third mode. I explained, the best way I could explain it back to David was to share an art experience that I had the very first time I went to a concert. Live music is probably the artistic discipline that resonates with me the most. I'm desperately missing live music at the moment and over the last couple of years. Last summer was the first summer I hadn't been to a concert since I was 14 years old. It's heartbreaking. Regardless, that first experience still sits with me because you're in a room and the music is flowing through you, and you're standing in a room of strangers and knowing that you're all feeling the same thing or feeling something so powerful because of the music that's resonating throughout that space. And that's incredible. That's unifying. That's something it's communicative, but it's more than that. It's more than traditional modes of communication. It is one thing that I believe that human beings can do that no other living thing that we know of can. And that's our unique superpower. How do we harness that power? How do we articulate it? I don't know if you can without just experiencing it. And so my mission has always been, from the get-go, to ensure that young people have exposure and opportunities to artistic experiences so that it sits with them as it did for me when I was young. And then it's a part of their lives. I think that's the only way to really transmit what arts can do truly for the betterment of the world.
Artist David Haley. We now need aesthetics to sensitize us to other ways of life. And we need artists to sensitize us to the shape of things to come.
And given that the world is in crisis, I guess arts practices will adapt and respond to the changing conditions, right?
Yeah, I think we have to. We already are. Given the acceleration that the pandemic provided, we had to pivot. And the one thing that just did not disappear was the need for the arts. In fact, it was augmented. So that in itself, I think, is evidence that how clearly the arts are needed within society towards a healthy society. So there'll certainly be, I think, and luckily for us as an art sector, we have innovation, creativity in our back pockets. So I think we'll be able to certainly devise new ways of not just creating work content-wise, but how it is shared with the rest of the world. So I'm very excited for the next 10 years to see how we go about using technology or making art more localized. I think that the last couple of years have definitely changed my perception on what cultural diplomacy means. I think that there are different ways that we can go about that. It's not about touring anymore. It's not about going from one country to the other beyond borders. It's in a physical sense. It's about finding ways of connecting us through artistic opportunities to bring us together. And what does that look like? I'm very, very curious to see what the arts can do to convene us together as a society around particular areas of challenges and interests, that we're all feeling and needing to face. And as I said, I think it's about bringing the arts into a frame where we could potentially provide a greater sense of solution, creative solution making, instead of just how we're sometimes viewed, which is art on walls or on stages. I think there's much more potential than that to engage the arts in society.
Well, at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about community-engaged arts and your interest in that. And I also have had a lifelong, before even I knew what the term was, I thought it was cool for professional artists, skilled professionals to work with communities and to have a mutually beneficial experience, right? Because, the notion of professional artists is a relatively new thing, because in other societies, you have art everywhere, and you have people who are creating without necessarily using the label. And I think it's all good, right? You benefit from having, you have to have professionals, but it's helpful to have very skilled, trained individuals. But then you have a whole spectrum of people who are interested in participating in the arts and doing work and creating their own songs and stories. And you need all of that. You all need all that creativity to be alive and well in any given society. What are your thoughts about community-engaged arts? I know you're interested. So how do you sit on that one?
You've hit on a real hot button issue for me, a real passion of mine. I almost feel as though even though I've only worked, my career's only 2 decades long, I feel like it's already come full circle. As I said in my introduction, when I felt when I wanted to work in the arts that I would end up having to work at an art gallery or a theater company. But then my whole world was opened up. The city of Ottawa has a community arts program, which I went ahead and did an internship with while I was in school there. And it just opened my world. And then I started working with some street artists. And my role in that was to really just help them administrate their ideas. So they wanted to do a project called Coats of Paint. So I got a bunch of coats donated, winter coats. Ottawa can be quite cold. Asked 12 artists to paint on them. I went and handed them out with a bunch of other artists at a homeless shelter, asked them to wear them over the winter, wrote my phone number into the coats and told them to call me and to return them to me in the spring in exchange for coupons at Loblaws. And because Ottawa is not that big, the downtown core, I saw these coats walking around all winter long. And it was such a magical and an emotional experience, because it wasn't necessarily about the art on the coats. It was about the message. It was about the highlight, the spotlight of what those coats were drawing attention to. All of the people who chose to live on the streets instead of, or their position was they were on the streets. Not sure if it was because they wanted to or they had no other choice, but that it was just a reminder that these people are part of the makeup of that city. And it was a beautiful reminder, because the art was beautiful. So the arts have the potential to do things like that. And if I can be a part of those particular projects, then that's what is important to me. That's what gets me excited.
Law professor Shalanda Baker. Will we redesign systems to replicate the current structures of power and control? Or will we reimagine our systems to benefit those who are so often left out of discussions regarding systems design?
Well, I spoke with Jill Weaving, with Jen Ray, with Marnie Badham in the series, who are all community engaged arts experts. And so there's been quite a bit of discourse on that. I think in the future, there will be more community engaged art just by the nature of the challenges that we face. We will need to work more locally and in a more sustained and cross-sectoral way. I think all that's coming. So it's good that there's language and methodologies and tools that have been developed over decades that will be able to be applied, and all the other art forms are valid as well. But community engaged arts ones, I think, will have a particular added value as we go forward. So, Robin, we are going to end soon, but I wanted to ask you one last question around some of the research that you talked about will help better understand how people's mindsets are changing. One of the areas of interest for me is around ethics. So, for instance, how will we going forward decide to travel? If you're, say, touring, or how will you consume energy? Like this conversation here is using up electricity. The ethical side of decisions that we make to do or not do something in terms of its impact on the environment, because unfortunately, a lot of the climate damage is baked into our environment. It's going to be rough going forward for a long time. We can reduce the amount of harm, and we have to reinvent the way that we work, including the arts, right? The arts are relatively low impact if you look at other sectors, but still, the artists need to think about how they're going to work differently. And I think it's an ethical question, because you have to make decisions based on values and things that you believe to be the right way to go. So any thoughts on that? Because I think that's going to be an area of research. You're already doing some of it, but also it's going to be something that artists are going to struggle with, because they're going to say, well, where do I draw the line? Where do I before you answer, I was going to say that Kendra Fanconi a couple of times has said, the 20-80 rule, which is, I think, really good. The 20% of your time, you try to change the things around you. You try to reduce your carbon footprint and change your behavior. And the rest of the time, the 80%, you try to change systems, because that's where the real power is. You try to influence how society, and you can do it through your art practice, you can do it in different ways, but that balance, that 20-80 balance is a pretty good start. But what are your thoughts on that whole ethical question around environmental responsibility?
Well, I think that when we're thinking about and talking about ethics, I think that there's just so little capacity or there has been for the sector to really take time to think through and make those ethical decisions. So I'm hoping that as we start to reopen as a sector, that we will be more considerate of the what needs to be considered. And I like what Kendra is putting forward with the 2080 suggestion. I think that I think we need to support organizations like Mass Culture that have committed to ensuring that there is capacity put into things such as ethics, because even creating a space for research requires those conversations of ethics. You can't really do and encourage research to occur within the arts community without really thinking through and thinking that through with a large group of people about what that means. What are your values? What kind of measures, checklist do we want to put in place when thinking through how we want to move forward on things? So I think that's a good practice to get into. Going back to thinking about climate, I think that we have to really consider, if we're going to do something, what are we going to do to counter it? And so I think that creating those types of tools for ourselves. For example, I applied for a grant to host a conference because it's been such a long time since our arts community has come together, and part of Mass Culture's mandate is to convene. And then I added a section to that application of working with a group of people to really think through, okay, to devise a tool to really think through whether I should be attending this conference in person or not, so that people can take the time to say, oh, I'm flying here from Whitehorse to Toronto, so that obviously isn't the best thing for the environment, but then what am I doing to counter that? So really trying to strike a balance and at least be aware that you are that you are doing that damage to the environment by attending. And if you're attending because you're speaking or because you need to be engaged and participating, then those are the things that you need to take in consideration.
I think that's something I'm going to talk about in the next season is, okay, now that we know A, B, C, what are we able to, and without penalizing us so much, because we could easily say there's value in my doing this tour. It's going to make the world a better place. I'm aware of the footprint. I will, counterbalance my behavior, or, at least I'm aware going into it that there's a footprint, and I think it's valid footprint, and I'm willing to defend it. And here's how I justify it. So thank you, Robin Sokoloski, for your many insights, and people now know more about mass culture and your role and scale, and your passion for community-engaged arts, which I find wonderful. Thanks for the exchange, and like I said, the ethical issues that we started to talk about, I think, will be part of the next waves of conversations that we'll have and gatherings that you'll do, and some of the podcast conversations I'll have, so that we can figure out how to move forward together, and in ways that are connected to the dynamic of a climate emergency.
I'm certainly interested in figuring out and working with all sorts of different people. Yes, thank you, Claude, for the opportunity.